Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I am stacking a few podcasts together. I've got a lot of work coming up in October. I'm going through some personal training, and then I, of course, have to give a whole bunch of training. So I am trying to get ahead of the curve here. So as some of you know, I've been doing a fair number of podcasts on bears. I still have one more to do on bears. I might have a second one beyond that when we're talking about, bear spray, yes, is going to be the next one. But today we're going to talk a little bit about commensal mousetraps. So if you're like, what is this Living the Wildlife podcast all about? Well, we're all about research-based information on all things related to the control of vertebrate pests. So that's animals with a spine. So we do deal with insects from time to time, but only insofar as they relate to wildlife, and animals with a spine. So in this sense, we're pest control, but we focus on the vertebrate pest side of the pest control umbrella. So we don't use the word pest control too often because many people confuse it with traditional pest control, which is dominated, of course, by insects. So this is often understood as wildlife damage management, wildlife control, vertebrate pest control is what we deal with here. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to get your questions, thoughts for new shows. Perhaps there's a question you would like to get answered. Perhaps there's a criticism that you would like to launch. Yes, we hear them all. We even sometimes respond to criticisms. If we think they have merit, we will respond to those particular criticisms as well. If you'd like to be on the show, we'd welcome guests being on our show. We think there's a lot of information out there that isn't getting a wider audience, and we want to be a platform for that. So if you're wondering what the interview is like, well, we have a lot of interviews. Just check one of our previous interviews out there. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised on how those go. Again, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Those of you that are interested in some of our literature, we have a number of books available. This is certainly one that I'm particularly proud of. I revised Steve Meyer's book, Being Kind to Animal Pests, talking about how to trap and control vertebrate pests in a more humane manner. I'm not an animal rights activist. If you were wondering, had any questions about that, check out some of my other books and certainly my podcast. You know, I have a long-standing contempt for the animal rights protest industry because I don't think that they are scientific, and I don't think they're environmentalists, and in some ways what they proclaim actually harms the environment and, in some cases, animals directly. So opened up a lot of worms there, but nevertheless, that's not today's subject at all. What is today's subject? Well, let me pull up my PowerPoint here. I came across an article which I thought was rather interesting. I think there's as some of you may know, there is a huge may be too strong of a term. There is a growing movement about concern for the humane management of commensal rodents. Now, if you're not familiar with that word, commensal rodents, it refers to animals that share our table, right? So house mice, Norway rats, roof rats. I would throw in there deer mice and white-footed mice as well. They often live around structures as well, although they are not invasive species here, at least in the United States. But nevertheless, there is growing concern, and you can see some of that concern, of course, with the growing outcry about the use of glue boards, right? So in England, for example, I did a podcast about this in the past, where they have banned glue board use in the UK. I believe Wales has, England has, and I believe Scotland has. I'm not sure about Northern Ireland at this point. But nevertheless, the trend is going. Here in the US, we have a number of companies that are beginning to ban the use of glue boards on their property. So when you have a contract, they will say to you, you are not allowed to use glue boards on our property. And if you are allowed, there may be a process that you have to go through before you're allowed to use glue boards. So this is significant. So the question, of course, is what about the snap traps? What is the level of humaneness with those? Now, the article that I came across doesn't directly address this particular question, but it's doing some of that foundational research to determine the strike force of various snap traps. As you know, there's a variety of rodent traps out there for mice and rats, and they did some evaluation, and this was primarily in a UK setting, and they were evaluating the strike force and the gripping power of these particular traps, because obviously both elements are an important component of traps. And they came up with some interesting things. Now, some of these traps are certainly available in the United States. You may recognize some of them from the photographs and saying, oh yeah, that's a trap we have here. Or maybe you even use them yourself. So we're not going to give information specifically on those individual traps. This is more of a 10,000 foot perspective to show you what things you need to think about as you're evaluating traps, because obviously more research will be done. So, just starting off the question here, of course, when was the last time you were thinking about the humaneness of your mouse and rat traps? Certainly, if you're not thinking about it, those of you in wealthier communities, more liberal communities, are going to certainly be hearing more about this. Some of you may already be using snap traps because your clients won't allow you to use rodenticides, but you're going to start seeing, if you haven't already, some concern about how humane those traps are. And so how do you answer that particular question? How do you respond to that? So this is an article published in 2012. Let me read it for you here. Mechanical performance of rat, mouse, and mole spring traps. We're not going to talk about mole traps here today. We're just going to focus on the mouse and rat traps and possible implications for welfare performance. This was done by Sandra E. Baker, Stephen A. Elwood, Vito L. Tagarielli, David W. McDonald, and it was published in a journal called PLOS One. That's PLOS 1, ONE. And this is available freely online. And if you're not familiar with PLOS One journal, they are what's called an open journal. That is, their publications are published out on the web, freely available to anyone with an internet connection. So you do not need to have a subscription to PLOS One. I don't even think there is a subscription to PLOS One. So it's available freely, and so you can download this article and see it in more detail if you wish. And I'm just going to kind of give a quick review over this particular article, focusing on the mouse and rat trap. Let me read that title for you again. Mechanical performance of rat, mouse, and mole spring traps and possible implications for welfare performance, by Sandra E. Baker, Stephen A. Elwood, Vito L. Tagarielli, David W. McDonald, and it was published in PLOS One in 2012. So the authors were based in the UK, and if you weren't aware of this, UK has trapping standards for a lot of the quote-unquote body gripping traps rather than encapsulating traps. Like encapsulating traps are, imprisonment. They capture the animal without touching any part of it, where body gripping traps are either going to be kill traps or restraining traps, and so they have rules governing those traps. Now, interestingly, commensal rodent traps, that's your rat and mouse traps, do not have, they don't have to meet the standards under the UK law. So these authors obviously appear to be concerned about animal welfare, and they're like, well, let's take a look at the striking and holding power of the various devices available in a UK context. And so they think that this can be one of the ways to approach how humane these devices are. They're obviously not dealing with the humaneness directly because they're not using animal samples here, right? So this is purely what we would call foundational research. How hard does that trap strike? How well does it hold the force after the trap has discharged? And that's clearly an idea of where we're moving. In other words, how much variance are there among these various of these traps that are being used. And so obviously they're laying the groundwork for standardization down the road. Obviously more work would need to be done in the real world. But if you are purchasing a trap in the UK for other animals, for example, in order for that trap to be legal in the UK, it would have to pass UK standards, and they have pretty rigid standards about how quickly animals need to die in those traps. Like, for example, if you're wondering what type of a trap would meet UK standards, well, my understanding, one of them is the tunnel trap produced by Wildlife Control Supplies is certainly one of them. Now, a trap here in the United States is used for squirrels. Some people may use it for mink or muskrat, but that trap does meet. And if you've ever seen it go off, you can say, yeah, that's pretty powerful striking bar, right? So that is an example of a trap that meets UK standards. So that's the kind of work that they are doing in this particular article. So what were some of the traps that they took a look at? Well, there's a lot going on in this photograph. Okay, and this is their photograph, of course, and they were taking a look at 23 mouse traps and 18 different rat traps, and you can see them all listed here. Now, some of them look pretty similar to what we have in the US. Some of them, of course, don't look that similar. It depends on, how wide you are looking for mouse traps here in the US. But certainly many of them here I can recognize several of them. Pretty straightforward. And so we have them in the US, and so they basically did studies on all of these particular traps. Now, when they were testing the traps, they chose 14 of each brand that they were using, and that's when they did their study. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first thing that they did was they tried to categorize and organize the traps based on their spring types. Now, the first one they called a peg type trap. That's PEG, and that's the symbol they use for it. Now, if you look carefully at the trap A, which is the first one, that's the peg trap, you'll notice that it only has one spring bar attached to the striker bar. There's only one. As opposed to the double peg, which is letter B, there are two springs, two individual springs. So in peg 1, you have one long spring. In peg 2, double peg, you have two smaller springs, both of them working independently to move that striker bar, right? So that's clearly a difference in spring type. Now, the jaw spring type is the kind that you see here in letter C, where the spring is on the outside of the jaw, and it pulls, and it kind of pulls that jaw down. Okay, this is called the jaw version. Now, the pull version is inside the jaws, as you can see here in this clamshell trap on letter D. So even if we don't look at any other part of this particular journal article, you can already begin to see that we paying close attention to the types of traps that we're buying, right? And so if you're experimenting with traps on your own, you want to be thinking about, is there a performance difference between traps that have just a peg or a double peg or if it's a jaw spring trap or a pull trap, right? And the two things that we're really concerned about when we're looking at trap performance, and that is its striking power, what's the likelihood that it's going to hit with enough force to kill the animal, and then secondly, if it doesn't kill, is it going to hold the animal so that it's going to be killed in a later period of time, or that it's not going to let it go. Right? So those are the two things we want to think about. So when you're evaluating your own experience with your equipment, this gives you categories to think about. So you're not just simply throwing out traps, you're actually evaluating the type of results you're getting, and now you're able to have criteria to judge that. Now, the second thing they looked at, of course, was the angle opening of the jaw compared to the platform that the jaw would be striking against. And so they categorized traps therefore on the basis of the angle of the opening of the jaws, right? So that brings us here to our next slide. Now, I didn't provide all the information they provided because they were actually repeating the 180, and I just didn't think it was that important for us. If you want to read the entire article, you're welcome to it. But again, we see that basically they've listed here 5 different angles of mousetrap openings. So this is another way for you to evaluate your mousetraps to determine, how wide is that jaw? Are you finding that certain types of jaws seem to have better kill rates? Some of you guys are out doing, let's be frank, you're doing a lot of mouse work out there. How much experimenting are you doing to see if you can improve the performance of your work? Remember, I've said multiple times in this podcast, I think that businesses should be spending around, no, I wouldn't say any more than 5%. I've historically said 5%, but at least 2 to 3% of your time should be spent doing some experimental work, because you're not going to get a competitive advantage over your competitors if you're all doing the same thing, right? The only way you're able to do something different than your opponents, or your competitors, is if you do something different. And how are you going to know that? And we care about the difference being something more effective. Whether it's more effective, whether it's more cost effective, the only way you find out is sometimes you have to experiment, but you have to have actual data, not just winging it from your gut, because there's a lot of biases that will come to the fore that will distort your understanding of the data, right? So here we have, with the mouse traps, we have 45-degree angle, 60-degree angle, 70-degree angle, 80-degree angle, and then 180-degree angle, right? So a lot of us, of course, are familiar with the 180-degree angle. It's your traditional snap trap with a wooden base, right? It goes from one end all the way over to the other end, right? And then you have the various types of spring types that are associated with them. And then they also calculated, of course, or recorded what kind of body material. Was it plastic? Was it wood? And those are the two primary ones for body material. But then it came to the bar material. You actually have 3 types of materials, right? Plastic, metal. Those are the 2 there. I thought I said 3. That's a mistake. But we have plastic and metal. And that is going to be certainly a difference in that regard as well. Now, rat traps were similar, but they started not at 45-degree angle, started at 70-degree angle, 80, 180, of course, and you can see the differences there. Plastic, metal, wood, and the body material again, bar material, plastic, and metal, of course, there again. Then they had to calculate the strike height. Now, the reason they had to do the strike height was they were going to be using a mechanical device to determine strike force and gripping pressure. Okay, so they had to standardize this. Obviously, rats are not all the same size. Mice are not all the same size. So they're standardizing, because where the bar comes across and hits the rodent, it's going to determine, that point is where you get the force that the trap is exerting against a particular animal. Now, the point that they're referring to, of course, is directly behind the front shoulders, okay? So how high is that, right? And so they did some literature searches, and I think they even ground truthed it with some of the animals that they had dealt with in the past or something. And they basically said, look, we're going to study these traps at a 20 millimeter height for mice and a 40 millimeter height for rats. And that's how they're going to standardize it. So we're going to measure the strike force at 20 millimeters for height for mice, and then twice that, of course, for rats, right? So that's going to be a difference there. And here are the results of what they found. And they found that there was a variance of the impact momentum, I'm calling it strike force, okay, of 0.01 to 0.06 newtons. And we'll talk about what newtons are, but just see the big picture here. Don't get too into the weeds, because it's going to be hard for you, especially you guys who are driving, right? So you're not going to be able to, but just get the big picture here. With rats, the variance was 0.03 to 0.25 newtons. So a quarter of a newton. Some of those traps were putting out a quarter of a newton. Now, in terms of clamping force, that's how much force the trap was holding once it fired. With mice, it was 1.69 to 9.36 newtons. With rats, it was 5.03 to 23.1 newtons. So again, pretty big variance. So let's summarize what that is. For mouse traps, the impact momentum, what I call strike force, varied on a factor of 6. So you could have one trap that was 6 times the strike force of another brand trap. With rat traps, the variance of the strike force was 8 times. In other words, one trap would be at one level, another trap of a different brand could be 8 times that difference, that strength. In the variance when it came to clamping force was not as significant. Here we have mouse traps. The variance on clamping force was 5.5 times, and in rat traps, the variance was only 4.5 times. Now, variance just means when you grab a different brand, it could be up to 4.5 times different from another trap. Of course, it could be anywhere. It could only be 0.1 difference, right? So a lot of traps could be very similar to the trap you're using. A lot of traps could be very different from the trap you're using. The point is, that's a pretty broad range in terms of both the impact momentum and the clamping force. And you know this intuitively, right? If you've grabbed a bunch of different traps, you know this to be true. Because you know that some traps you definitely don't want to be snapped by, and others you're like, okay, I'm going to get snapped by it, but I don't care. The other element that they found was that the impact momentum overlapped between 13 mouse traps and 2 rat traps. Now that's amazing to me. How is it possible that a rat trap would have the same impact momentum as a mouse trap? That just blows my mind, right? I'd be thinking, wow, that's either a really powerful mouse trap or it's a pretty wimpy rat trap. That's what I'm thinking. But maybe that's false, right? This is where you have to ground truth it. The point here is that they are doing this foundational research that ultimately someone needs to now take it and actually apply this information to live animals, right? But this is something you don't have to wait for the research to be done. You can start gathering your own data from your own field work and start thinking about how often am I losing animals, from this trap? How often do I find animals still alive? Now, obviously, if you're looking at still alive, you have to check the trap at least on a daily basis, right? If it's a week later, you're not going to know. But if you're checking on a daily basis and you're starting to find a lot of live animals, then maybe the strike force of that trap just isn't strong enough to take that rodent out, okay? Now, in terms of the clamping force, 9 mouse traps and 10 rat traps overlapped. So again, a lot of overlap both in the impact momentum, what I call strike force, and clamping force, that's the holding power. A lot of overlap among the traps. Now, some of you were probably wondering, like I was, like, what's a Newton, right? How much force are we talking about here? Well, a Newton is a unit of force needed to accelerate 1 kilogram, 1 meter per second squared in the direction of the applied force. Now, a kilogram, if you're not familiar with that, is 2.2 pounds. 1 meter, of course, is about 39 inches. It's a little bit larger than a yard. Of course, you all know what a second is per squared. So that is what a Newton is. And so when we talked about impact force, the mousetraps were 0.03, pretty small. Why? Because it's not a kilogram, right? But your rat traps were significantly more powerful. They were getting up to the quarter Newton, right? So now to give you an idea of how much force a Newton is just on a practical basis, if you drop a ball, for instance, the force pulling that ball to the ground is, on our gravity, is 9.8 newtons. So the gravity of the Earth, on average, is going to be 9.8 newtons. So that kind of gives you something to work with when we're dealing with this sort of abstract concept of newtons. Now here's a diagram showing the relationship between clamping force and impact momentum. And they have the mouse traps. The mouse traps that they studied, of course, are listed in circles. The rat traps are listed in triangles. And you can see where the two groupings overlap. So there were like 23 mouse traps studied, so there should be 23 circles there, and I think there were 13 rat traps studied, and you'll see 13 triangles there as well. So it kind of gives you an idea of how much overlap there was. So like I said, either it's a really wimpy rat trap or a really powerful rodent mouse trap or something both. But you can see how much force was involved there in terms of these particular elements. So what do we do with this information? Well, in general, we're talking broad strokes here, right? Because we don't want to get too far into the weeds. They found that in terms of rat traps, the larger the opening angle of the trap, the greater the momentum impact. That's that strike force. So as a general rule, not always, but as a general rule, traps that would have had the striker bar move 180 degrees would have greater strike force than those that only moved 80 degrees. But in contrast, clamping force, in other words, how well the trap held, was greater in traps that had a smaller opening, which is a little counterintuitive, I guess, but maybe not. Those of you a little bit more physics background may be able to say, oh, no, that makes perfect sense. Now, what about mouse traps? Well, with mouse traps, openings that were between 90 degrees and 134 degrees had the highest momentum impact. So those traps that had a jaw opening of 90 degrees to a little bit larger had the highest momentum impact. But the clamping force was greater in traps with the smaller opening. So the narrower the opening of the jaws, the greater the clamping force, but only those traps that were using, are at the 90 to 134 range had the highest momentum impact. And they kept frequently saying a lot of these statistics were not statistically significant, right? So that is certainly a problem. But they did summarize the data as they got it. Now, one of the questions you may be asking yourself, and that is, do more expensive traps work better in terms of the striking force and the clamping power? The answer to the researchers was no. I found that a little ironic. So just because you're paying more for a trap doesn't mean it has better striking power or gripping power. So this is where you could be getting a trap that's cheaper in terms of less expensive, but actually have greater striking power and greater clamping power than a trap that costs more than that one. So don't just simply buy on the basis of price. We often say, you get what you pay for. Well, that's often true to a point, right? So in terms of just on an evaluation of traps on the basis of the strength of their springs, more money does not necessarily get stronger pegs. So I suspect that some of those traps that you're paying more money for, you're getting other benefits from them. Maybe they're all plastic. Maybe they're just more convenient for you to use, and they're using more expensive materials that make it convenient for you in other ways. So think about ways that you're going to evaluate your traps. Think about the opening angle of your jaws. Think about what kind of strike force. How often are you losing the animals? And begin to think about comparing traps with other brands of traps to see if you can find something that may work better for you, or you may find out you have the best on the market right now, and maybe that might encourage some of you out there to be producing even a better mouse trap in terms of striking force and gripping power, and still be at a cost-effective level. But I would suspect more research will be done in this once the law changes and there's requirements for certain levels of strike force and kill capacity among these traps. But that legislation hasn't been done yet. But who knows? It could happen quicker than we think. When is that going to come to America? I don't know. There's a lot of variables about that. One of them, of course, is how much the industry is going to push back on that. And, I would encourage the industry, it needs to be always working harder to improve their work so it doesn't have to worry about regulation and just try to be cutting. When you're cutting edge, you don't have to worry about bad regulation because you're already ahead of it. But a lot of people don't do that. But nevertheless, that's a topic for another story. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. I do hope you subscribe to my channel. You can do that for ring the bell. Give us a 5-star review if you would, and also give us a review. If you don't like dealing with the present the present service, you can go over to Rumble and download my podcast there. Just look up Wildlife Control Consultant. Welcome feedback. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And comments, criticisms, thoughts, maybe suggestions for new shows, or perhaps you'd want to be on the show, definitely reach out to me. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.